In the grand corridors of Windmere Palace, where every footstep echoes with centuries of tradition and every whispered conversation could shape a nation's future, Prince Alexander had always believed that love could conquer any challenge the crown might present. He had weathered scandals, navigated political storms, and faced the relentless scrutiny of millions with unwavering strength. But nothing, not his years of royal training, not his military service, not even his deepest faith, had prepared him for the moment when the woman who had become his anchor, his conscience, and his greatest love would speak her final words in a sterile hospital room, forever changing not just his life, but the very foundation of the monarchy itself. What happens when a future king discovers that the heaviest crown he'll ever wear isn't made of gold and jewels, but of grief and the impossible weight of carrying on when the light of his life has been extinguished? This is the story of how 5 words whispered in a hospital corridor would bring the strongest man in the kingdom to his knees, and how a nation would watch their future sovereign learn that sometimes the most royal thing you can do is simply be human. The autumn rain pelted against the tall windows of St. Mary's Private Medical Center as Prince Alexander paced the length of the sterile corridor for what felt like the 1,000th time in the past 6 hours. His usually immaculate appearance had deteriorated throughout the day. His tie hung loosely around his neck, his hair was disheveled from constantly running his hands through it, and his eyes were rimmed with the kind of exhaustion that sleep could never cure. Princess Catherine had been admitted 3 days ago when what they thought was a simple case of fatigue had revealed itself to be something far more sinister. The doctors had used words like aggressive and advanced, but Alexander had refused to hear them. He couldn't hear them. Not about Catherine. Not about the woman who had transformed from a commoner with the infectious laugh and unwavering moral compass into the people's princess, beloved by millions and absolutely essential to his very existence. Dr. Margaret Hensley approached him with the careful steps of someone who had delivered devastating news too many times in her career. She was the kingdom's most respected oncologist, handpicked by the royal physicians, and her reputation for both brilliant medical care and gentle bedside manner had made her the obvious choice when Catherine's condition had become clear. But even her decades of experience hadn't prepared her for the unique challenge of treating a beloved royal while managing the emotional devastation of a prince who refused to accept reality. "Your Royal Highness," she said softly, causing Alexander to stop his pacing mid-stride. Something in her tone made his blood freeze. It wasn't the formal respect he'd grown accustomed to, but rather the gentle sympathy reserved for the grieving. "I think you should sit down." No. The word came out sharper than he intended, but Alexander couldn't help it. Standing meant he was still in control, still fighting, still refusing to surrender to whatever news was coming. "Just tell me what you need to tell me. Is she responding to the new treatment? Can we try the experimental protocol from Switzerland?" What about Alexander? The use of his first name, without title or ceremony, stopped him completely. Dr. Hensley had never addressed him so informally, and the intimacy of it in this moment felt like a goodbye. "The treatments aren't working. The cancer has spread faster than we anticipated, and her body isn't responding to any of our interventions. I'm so very sorry, but we need to start thinking about comfort measures now." The words hit him like a physical blow, and for a moment, Alexander thought he might actually collapse. The corridor seemed to tilt around him, and he reached out to steady himself against the wall. "Comfort measures," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying that we need to focus on keeping her comfortable and pain-free for whatever time she has left. Days, possibly a week at most. I wish I had better news, but I've consulted with every specialist in Europe, and we've exhausted all medical options." Alexander closed his eyes and tried to steady his breathing. In his mind, he could see Catherine as she had been just a month ago, laughing at something their 3-year-old son Prince James had said, her eyes bright with the kind of joy that had first caught his attention at a charity gala 5 years earlier. She had been standing by the auction table, bidding on a painting created by children in foster care, and when she'd noticed him watching her, she'd smiled and said, "They deserve to know their art matters, don't you think?" That simple statement had revealed everything he would come to love about her. Her ability to see dignity and worth in everyone, her instinct to nurture, and her complete lack of concern for impressing him simply because of his title. "I want to see her," he said, opening his eyes and straightening his shoulders in a gesture that reminded Dr. Hensley that despite his grief, she was still addressing the future king. "And I want to know exactly what we can do to manage her pain. Every option, every possibility. She will not suffer. Do you understand me? Of course, Your Royal Highness. We have an excellent palliative care team, and I promise you that keeping her comfortable is our absolute priority. She's awake now, and she's been asking for you. Alexander nodded curtly and began walking toward Catherine's room, but Dr. Hensley's voice stopped him. Your Royal Highness? She wants to speak with you alone first, but she's also requested that after your conversation, you allow Prince James to see her. And she'd like the Queen Mother to come as well. The mention of his son made Alexander's carefully maintained composure crack slightly. James was only 3 years old, barely old enough to understand why Mummy had been at the hospital for so long, certainly too young to comprehend that she might never come home. How do you explain death to a child who still believes that broken toys can be fixed, and that every story has a happy ending? Does James know? Alexander asked. She wants to be the one to tell him, in her own way. She's been working with one of our child psychologists to figure out the best approach. She's thought of everything, Your Royal Highness. Even in this situation, she's thinking of everyone else first. Alexander felt his throat tighten. That was Catherine exactly, facing her own mortality, and still orchestrating how to minimize everyone else's pain. It was the same instinct that had made her beloved by the public, the same quality that had made her such an exceptional royal, and the same characteristic that made losing her feel like the universe was fundamentally broken. He reached Catherine's room and paused for a moment outside the door, trying to compose himself. Through the small window, he could see her propped up against pillows, her once lustrous brown hair now covered by a silk scarf, her face pale but still bearing that gentle expression that had always made him feel like he was home. She was writing in a leather-bound journal, probably letters for James to open on future birthdays, or notes for the various charities she championed. Even now, even facing this, she was still taking care of everyone else. Alexander knocked gently and entered when he heard her soft "come in." Catherine looked up and smiled, not the radiant, full-face smile that had graced thousands of magazine covers, but a quieter version, tinged with sadness but still unmistakably hers. "Hello, my love," she said, setting the journal aside and extending her hand to him. "You look terrible." Despite everything, Alexander found himself laughing, a short, broken sound, but genuine. "You're dying, and you're worried about how I look?" "I'm always going to worry about how you look," Catherine replied, her thumb stroking across his knuckles as he took her hand. "That's what wives do, even dying wives." Alexander sat down heavily in the chair beside her bed, still holding her hand like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. "Don't say that. Don't use that word. Dying." Catherine's voice was gentle but firm. "Darling, we have to use that word. We have to talk about this. There are things I need to say, things I need you to promise me, and we don't have much time." "We have time," Alexander insisted, his grip on her hand tightening. "Dr. Hensley said days, maybe a week. That's time. We can figure out another treatment, another option. There has to be something we haven't tried." Catherine studied his face with the kind of loving attention that had always made him feel completely seen and understood. "Alexander, look at me. Really look at me." He did, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself to see what he'd been refusing to acknowledge. Catherine was dying. The woman who had been so vibrant, so alive just weeks ago, was now a shadow of herself. Her skin had taken on a translucent quality, her breathing was labored even at rest, and there was something in her eyes, not fear, but a kind of peaceful resignation that terrified him more than panic would have. "I know you want to fix this," she continued softly. "You've spent your entire life solving problems, protecting people, making things right. But this isn't something you can fix, and I need you to accept that so we can focus on what really matters." "What really matters is keeping you alive," Alexander said desperately. "What really matters is James having his mother, and me having my wife, and the country having their future queen. What really matters is that I can't do any of this without you." Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "You can do this without me, because I'm going to make sure you're ready. That's what we're going to talk about. But first, I need you to make me a promise." Alexander felt his heart racing, terrified of what she might ask, but knowing he would agree to anything if it brought her peace. "What?" "Promise me that you'll let yourself grieve. When I'm gone, don't try to be the stoic prince immediately. Don't worry about what the press says or what the protocols demand. Take the time you need to fall apart, because if you don't, you'll never be able to put yourself back together properly." The request surprised him. Throughout their 5-year relationship, Catherine had always been his partner in managing the enormous pressure of royal life. She understood better than anyone the weight of constant public scrutiny, the way every emotion was analyzed and criticized, the impossible balance between being human and being royal. For her to explicitly give him permission to be vulnerable felt both like a gift and like she was asking him to imagine a world where she wouldn't be there to help him carry the burden. "I don't know how to grieve publicly," he admitted. "I don't know how to be heartbroken in front of millions of people." "You don't have to figure that out right now," Catherine said. "But promise me you'll try. Promise me you won't pretend this doesn't hurt. James will need to see that it's okay to feel sad, that missing someone you love isn't weakness." Alexander nodded, not trusting his voice. Catherine squeezed his hand and continued. "And promise me you'll help him remember me accurately, not as some perfect saint, but as I really was. Tell him about how I always burned the pancakes on Sunday mornings, and how I couldn't parallel park to save my life, and how I used to sing off-key in the shower. Tell him about the time I got so nervous before my first state dinner that I threw up on my shoes, and how I once accidentally called the Prime Minister by the wrong name for an entire conversation. Catherine, let me finish, please. I need to know that he'll grow up understanding that I was human, with flaws and fears and silly habits, because that's what made my love for him real. Perfect people can't love properly. They don't understand what it means to need someone else." Alexander brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm. "He'll know exactly who you were. I promise." "Good." Catherine shifted slightly in bed, wincing as the movement caused pain. Alexander immediately reached to help her adjust her pillows, but she waved him off. "There's something else. About us, about our marriage." "What about it?" "I want you to find love again." The words hit Alexander like a slap. "What?" "Catherine, how can you even listen to me?" she interrupted, her voice taking on the firm tone he recognized from their rare arguments. "I'm not saying tomorrow, I'm not saying next year. But someday, when you've grieved and when James is older, I want you to be open to the possibility of finding someone who can love you both the way you deserve." "I will never love anyone the way I love you," Alexander said fiercely. "Never. I know that. And I'm not asking you to. What I'm asking is that you don't close your heart permanently because you think staying alone somehow honors my memory. The best way to honor my memory is to live fully, to be happy, to give James the chance to see his father in love and loved in return." Alexander stared at her in disbelief. Even now, even facing death, Catherine was thinking about his future happiness, worried about him becoming a bitter widower locked in grief. It was so typically her, so characteristically selfless, that it made his chest ache with a pain that had nothing to do with loss, and everything to do with overwhelming gratitude for having been loved by someone so extraordinary. "I can't imagine wanting anyone else," he said honestly. "You don't have to imagine it now. Just promise me you won't actively avoid it if it happens naturally." Alexander considered this for a long moment. The idea of loving someone else felt impossible, almost offensive to everything he felt for Catherine. But he could see the genuine concern in her eyes, the worry that her death might trap him in a kind of emotional prison that would ultimately harm both him and James. "I promise I won't close myself off completely," he said finally. "But, Catherine, I need you to understand that what we have, this doesn't happen twice in a lifetime." "Maybe not," she agreed. "But love comes in many forms, and you have such a capacity for it. Don't waste that gift." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, Alexander holding Catherine's hand while she dozed fitfully. The pain medication made her drowsy, but every few minutes she would wake and squeeze his hand, as if checking to make sure he was still there. Each time, Alexander would lean forward and whisper, "I'm here," or "I love you," and she would smile and drift off again. As evening approached, a nurse knocked gently and entered with dinner trays, though neither Alexander nor Catherine had much appetite. Catherine managed a few spoonfuls of soup, more to appease Alexander than from any real desire to eat, while Alexander ignored his meal entirely. "You need to eat," Catherine observed. "And you need to go home and shower and see James. He's been asking about you." "I'm not leaving you," Alexander said immediately. "You're not leaving me permanently, but you need to take care of yourself and our son. I'm not going anywhere tonight, I promise." Alexander wanted to argue, but he could see the exhaustion in Catherine's face and knew that his constant presence, however well-intentioned, might be preventing her from getting the rest she needed. Reluctantly, He agreed to go home for a few hours. "I'll be back first thing in the morning," he said, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "I know you will," Catherine replied. "Give James a hug from Mummy, and tell him I love him very much." Alexander nodded and headed for the door, but Catherine's voice stopped him one more time. "Alexander, remember what I said about grieving. Don't try to be superhuman. Not even for me." He looked back at her one final time, memorizing her face in the soft evening light, and then forced himself to leave the room. As he walked down the corridor toward the exit, Alexander had no way of knowing that those would be among the last coherent words Catherine would ever speak to him, and that within 18 hours, his entire world would collapse with 5 simple words that would echo in his mind for the rest of his life. Alexander returned to Kensington Palace near midnight, his body exhausted, but his mind racing too frantically for sleep. The palace felt different somehow, larger and emptier than usual, as though Catherine's absence had physically altered the space. Every room held memories that felt simultaneously precious and painful. The sitting room where she would read to James before bed, the kitchen where she insisted on making her own tea despite the staff's protests, the study where she would work late into the evening on speeches for her charitable causes. James was asleep in his nursery, watched over by his longtime nanny, Mrs. Elizabeth Caro. The older woman looked up as Alexander quietly entered the room, her eyes immediately conveying both sympathy and concern. Mrs. Caro had been with the royal family for over 30 years, had helped raise Alexander himself, and possessed the rare ability to balance absolute discretion with genuine care. "How is she, Your Royal Highness?" Mrs. Caro whispered, rising from her chair beside James's bed. Alexander looked down at his sleeping son, a perfect miniature version of Catherine with her brown hair and gentle features, but with Alexander's stubborn chin and long limbs. James was sprawled across his small bed, one arm wrapped around his favorite stuffed elephant, completely peaceful in the way that only small children can be. The sight of him sleeping so soundly, unaware that his world was about to be shattered, made Alexander's chest tighten with protective anguish. "Not good, Mrs. Caro," Alexander replied quietly. "The doctors say, they say it's a matter of days now." Mrs. Caro's face crumpled slightly, but she quickly composed herself. She had loved Catherine like a daughter, had watched her transform from a nervous young woman overwhelmed by royal protocol into a confident princess beloved by the nation. "What can I do to help, Your Highness?" "Catherine wants to see James tomorrow. She wants to explain things to him herself." Alexander's voice caught on the words. "I don't know how to prepare him for that conversation." Mrs. Caro nodded thoughtfully. "Princess Catherine is wise to want to speak with him herself. Children understand more than we think they do, and they're much more resilient when they hear difficult news from someone they trust completely. Shall I help him choose something special to bring to Mummy?" "Yes, please." "And Mrs. Caro?" Alexander paused, struggling with the words he needed to say. "After Catherine, afterwards, James is going to need extra attention. Extra care. I don't know how present I'll be able to be initially. You don't need to worry about Prince James, Your Royal Highness. He'll be loved and cared for, no matter what happens. And children have a remarkable ability to help adults heal, if we let them." Alexander nodded gratefully and spent a few more minutes watching his son sleep before forcing himself to leave the nursery. In his own bedroom, the master suite he had shared with Catherine for 3 years, everything smelled faintly of her perfume. Her books were still stacked on her nightstand, her reading glasses folded on top, her jewelry box set open on the dresser, exactly as she'd left it the morning she'd been admitted to the hospital. He showered mechanically, trying not to think about the conversation awaiting him the next day or the impossible task of explaining death to a 3-year-old. Instead, he focused on Catherine's request that he allow himself to grieve, that he not try to be superhuman. The advice felt both liberating and terrifying. He had spent his entire adult life learning to manage his emotions publicly, to be the steady, reliable future king that the nation expected. The idea of falling apart, even temporarily, felt like failing in his most fundamental duty. Alexander's phone buzzed with a text message from his private secretary, Sir David Thornbury, asking for an update and reminding him of several upcoming engagements that would likely need to be postponed. The mundane reminder of his regular duties felt surreal in light of the previous day's events. How could he possibly care about ribbon cuttings and charity galas when Catherine was dying? How could the world simply continue turning as though nothing had changed? But even as he thought this, Alexander knew that the world's continuation was exactly what Catherine would want. She had spent 5 years learning to balance personal desires with public duty, had understood better than anyone that royal life meant serving something larger than yourself. She would want him to grieve, but she would also want him to find a way to continue their shared work, to honor their commitments to the people and causes they both cared about. Alexander fell into a restless sleep sometime after 2 a.m., only to wake 4 hours later from a vivid dream where Catherine had been healthy and laughing, planning their summer holiday with James. The jarring return to reality felt like losing her all over again, and Alexander found himself lying in bed for several minutes, trying to summon the strength to face another day. His phone rang at 6:30 a.m. Dr. Hensley's name appeared on the caller ID, and Alexander's heart immediately began racing. Calls from the hospital at this hour could only mean one thing. Dr. Hensley, he answered on the first ring. Your Royal Highness, Princess Catherine is asking for you. Her condition has deteriorated during the night, and she's quite insistent that she needs to speak with you immediately. Alexander was already getting out of bed, reaching for clothes. I'm on my way. How long do I have? Just come as quickly as you can, Your Royal Highness. The drive to the hospital felt interminable, despite the early morning traffic and the police escort that cleared their path. Alexander's protection officer, Detective Inspector Sarah Mills, had been briefed on the situation and maintained professional silence during the journey, but Alexander could see her concerned glances in the rearview mirror. D.I. Mills had been part of Catherine's security detail for 2 years and had developed both professional respect and personal fondness for the princess. At the hospital, Dr. Hensley met Alexander at the entrance with an expression that immediately told him everything he needed to know. Catherine was dying, and it was happening faster than anyone had anticipated. She's been in and out of consciousness since about 4 a.m., Dr. Hensley explained as they walked quickly toward Catherine's room. But when she's awake, she's been asking for you repeatedly. We've increased her pain medication, which means she may be somewhat disoriented, but she's been very clear about wanting to see you. Alexander nodded, trying to prepare himself for whatever he might find. As they reached Catherine's door, Dr. Hensley placed a gentle hand on his arm. Your Royal Highness, I should warn you that she looks quite different from yesterday. The progression has been very rapid. Alexander steeled himself and entered the room, but nothing could have prepared him for the sight that greeted him. Catherine, who just 12 hours earlier had been tired but still recognizably herself, now looked incredibly frail. Her breathing was labored and irregular. Her skin had taken on a waxy pallor, and there was an otherworldly quality to her appearance that made Alexander's knees nearly buckle. But when she heard his voice saying her name, Catherine's eyes opened, and for a moment, they were as clear and present as ever. Alexander, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I was afraid you wouldn't make it in time. In time for what? He asked, taking her hand and sitting in the familiar chair beside her bed. I told you I'd be back first thing this morning. Catherine smiled weakly. I need to tell you something important. About James, about what he'll need from you. Catherine, save your energy. We can talk about James later, after you've rested. No, we can't, she replied with a firmness that surprised him given her physical state. Later might not come, and this is too important to leave unsaid. Alexander felt his throat close up, but he nodded for her to continue. James is going to have questions about death, about where I've gone. Don't let anyone tell him that I'm sleeping or that I've gone on a long trip. He needs to understand that death is permanent, that I can't come back, but also that love doesn't die. Tell him that the love between us will always be alive in his heart. Catherine, and don't let him think that his sadness is something to be fixed or gotten over quickly. Grief is love with nowhere to go, and that's not a problem to be solved. It's a connection to be honored. Alexander was crying now, not caring about composure or protocol. How do you know exactly what to say about everything? How are you making this easier for everyone else when you're the one who's? Because I've had time to think about it, Catherine interrupted gently. And because making things easier for the people I love is how I show love. It's what gives my life meaning, right up until the end. They talked for another hour, Catherine drifting in and out of consciousness, but always returning to the same themes. James's emotional well-being, Alexander's need to eventually find happiness again, the importance of continuing their charitable work, and practical details about funeral arrangements that she had been considering. Her clarity during these conversations was remarkable given her condition, as though she were drawing on some final reserve of strength to ensure that everything important was communicated. Around 10 a.m., Mrs. Caro arrived with James, who was clutching his stuffed elephant and a hand-drawn picture he had made for his mother. The sight of the small boy walking solemnly into the hospital room, clearly sensing that something was very wrong but not understanding what, nearly broke Alexander's composure completely. "Hello, my darling boy," Catherine said softly as Mrs. Caro lifted James up to sit on the edge of her bed. "Did you bring Ellie with you?" she asked, referring to the stuffed elephant. "Yes, Mummy. And I made you a picture. It's you and me and Daddy at the park." James held up his crayon drawing, which showed 3 stick figures standing under what might have been a tree, all of them smiling. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. Can you tell me about it?" As James began explaining his artwork with the serious concentration that 3-year-olds bring to their creative endeavors, Alexander watched Catherine's face transform. Despite her obvious pain and exhaustion, she was completely present for their son, asking questions about the colors he had chosen and praising his artistic decisions. It was a masterclass in maternal love, the ability to set aside your own suffering to give a child exactly what he needs in that moment. After James finished explaining his picture, Catherine took a deep breath and began one of the most difficult conversations any parent ever has to have. "James, you know how Mummy has been sick and staying at the hospital?" James nodded solemnly. "Are you coming home soon?" "No, sweetheart. I'm not going to be able to come home. My body is too sick to get better, and soon I'm going to die." "Do you know what that means?" Alexander watched his son's face carefully, ready to intervene if the conversation became too overwhelming. But James considered the question with the seriousness that children often bring to life's biggest mysteries. "Like when Grandpa Henry died last year?" James asked. Alexander's grandfather had passed away peacefully in his sleep, and they had tried to explain death to James in age-appropriate terms at the time. "Exactly like that," Catherine confirmed. "When people die, their bodies stop working, and they can't come back. But the love we have for each other never dies. That stays forever." "Will it hurt?" James asked, and Alexander had to grip the arms of his chair to keep from falling apart at his son's innocent concern for his mother's suffering. "No, sweetheart. The doctors are making sure it won't hurt. I'll just go to sleep, and then I won't be sick anymore." James was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Then he looked at his father. "Daddy, will you be sad?" "Yes, James. I'll be very sad because I love Mummy very much, and I'll miss her. It's okay to be sad when someone we love dies. You might be sad too, and that's perfectly normal. But you'll still take care of me?" "Always," Alexander said firmly. "No matter what happens, I will always take care of you. And Mrs. Caro will help, and Grandmama Queen will help, and all the people who love us will help." Catherine reached out to stroke James's hair. "And even though I won't be here in person, I'll still love you every day. When you see something beautiful, like a rainbow or a butterfly, you can think of me. When you do something kind for someone else, that's me loving other people through you. When you laugh or play or learn something new, part of me will be happy too." The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with Catherine answering James's questions with remarkable honesty and age-appropriate wisdom. She explained that there would be a funeral where people would say goodbye, that Daddy might cry sometimes, and that was okay, and that James should always feel free to talk about her and ask questions about her. When it became clear that Catherine was growing tired, Mrs. Caro gently suggested that James might want to give Mummy a special hug and let her rest. James hugged his mother carefully, as though sensing her fragility, and whispered, "I love you, Mummy. I love you too, my perfect boy, more than all the stars in the sky." After Mrs. Caro left with James, Catherine turned to Alexander with tears streaming down her face. "That was the hardest thing I've ever done, but also the most important. You were incredible with him," Alexander said. "You gave him exactly what he needed to hear. I hope so. I hope I've given you both what you need to move forward without me." They spent the rest of the day together, sometimes talking, sometimes just holding hands in comfortable silence. Catherine's periods of consciousness grew shorter and further apart as the day progressed, but each time she woke up, she would squeeze Alexander's hand and smile, as if checking to make sure he was still there. As evening approached, Dr. Hensley quietly informed Alexander that Catherine's vital signs were becoming increasingly irregular. "It could be tonight," she said gently. "You should call anyone who wants to say goodbye." Alexander's mother, the Queen Mother, arrived at 8 p.m., along with Catherine's parents and her sister. They took turns sitting with her, sharing quiet words and gentle touches, creating a circle of love around her in her final hours. Around 11 p.m., as Alexander held Catherine's hand and the others dozed fitfully in nearby chairs, Catherine opened her eyes one last time. Her breathing had become very shallow, and Alexander could see that she was struggling to speak. "What is it, my love?" he whispered, leaning close to hear her. Catherine's lips moved almost imperceptibly, and Alexander had to strain to catch her words. When he finally understood what she was trying to say, 5 simple words that would forever change his understanding of love and loss, the sound that escaped from his throat was barely human, a raw, primal expression of grief that seemed to come from the deepest part of his soul. The palace hallway, which had echoed with centuries of royal history, fell silent as the future King of England learned that some words, once spoken, have the power to break even the strongest heart completely. "Promise me you'll be happy." Those 5 words, whispered with Catherine's final breath at 11:47 p.m., shattered Alexander's world in a way that no amount of preparation could have prevented. They weren't the desperate declarations of love he had expected, nor the urgent reminders about James that he thought she might prioritize in her last moments. Instead, Catherine had used her final conscious act to think about his future happiness, a gift so characteristic of her selfless nature that it felt like being stabbed through the heart with pure love. The sound that had escaped from Alexander's throat in that moment was something between a sob and a scream, a noise he didn't know he was capable of making. It brought everyone in the room instantly awake and rushing to Catherine's bedside, but it was too late. She was gone, her hands still warm in Alexander's, her face peaceful in a way it hadn't been for days. Dr. Hensley gently checked for vital signs, her actions a mere formality since everyone in the room could sense the profound stillness that had settled over Catherine's body. "Time of death, 23:47, she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion despite her professional training. The Queen Mother was the first to reach Alexander, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder as he continued to grip Catherine's lifeless hand. "Alexander, my dear boy," she said softly, her own voice breaking with grief. Throughout his life, his grandmother had been a source of strength and wisdom, but even she seemed diminished by the magnitude of this loss. "She asked me to promise to be happy," Alexander said, his voice hollow and disbelieving. "In her last moment, she was worried about my happiness. How can I ever be happy without her?" Catherine's mother, Eleanor, approached from the other side of the bed, her face streaked with tears but her demeanor remarkably composed. "That's exactly what Catherine would do," she said, reaching out to smooth her daughter's hair one final time. Even as a little girl, she couldn't bear for anyone around her to be sad. She used to give away her favorite toys if she thought it would make someone feel better. The next few hours passed in a surreal blur of necessary arrangements and impossible realities. Royal protocol demanded immediate notification of senior government officials, coordination with the palace communications team, and implementation of carefully planned procedures that had been rehearsed but never used. Alexander moved through these requirements mechanically, his body present but his spirit still seated beside Catherine's hospital bed, trying to process the weight of her final words. Sir David Thornbury, Alexander's private secretary, arrived at the hospital within an hour of Catherine's death, followed shortly by a small army of protocol officers, security personnel, and communications experts. The machine of royal death was now in motion, announcements to be crafted, flags to be lowered, a nation to be informed that their beloved princess was gone. "Your Royal Highness," Sir David said gently, "we need to discuss the timing of the public announcement and your statement to the nation." Alexander looked at him with eyes that seemed to have aged years in a single night. "Statement. The people will expect to hear from you directly, sir. Words of thanks for the medical team, acknowledgement of the public's love for Princess Catherine, and some indication of your intentions going forward." The idea of making a public statement felt impossible. How could he find words to share with millions of people when he couldn't even process his private grief? How could he thank people for their sympathy when sympathy felt inadequate to address the crater that Catherine's death had left in his existence? "I can't," Alexander said simply. "Not tonight. Not yet. Of course, sir. We can delay until tomorrow. But the announcement of Princess Catherine's death cannot wait much longer. The staff who were here tonight will maintain confidentiality, but news of this magnitude cannot be contained indefinitely." Alexander nodded mechanically. He understood the logic, even appreciated the gentle way Sir David was managing these impossible circumstances, but the practical demands of royal death felt like violence against his grief. Catherine had been gone for less than 3 hours, and already the world was demanding that he transform his private loss into a public performance. "I want to go home," Alexander said finally. "I want to see James." The drive back to Kensington Palace took place in complete silence, Alexander staring out the window at the London streets that looked exactly the same as they had 12 hours earlier, despite the fact that everything had fundamentally changed. How was it possible for the world to appear unchanged when Catherine no longer existed in it? How could traffic lights still cycle through their patterns, and late-night pedestrians still walk their dogs when the most vital person Alexander had ever known was gone forever? At the palace, Mrs. Caro was waiting in the entrance hall, her eyes red with tears, but her posture steady and professional. She had been informed of Catherine's death and had the heartbreaking task of being ready to help James through his first moments of motherlessness. "Is he awake?" Alexander asked. "No, Your Royal Highness. He's been sleeping peacefully. I thought you might want to be the one to tell him when he wakes up naturally in the morning." Alexander felt another wave of the strange gratitude that had been hitting him intermittently since Catherine's death. Gratitude for the people who anticipated his needs, who understood the weight of his responsibilities, who helped carry burdens he couldn't manage alone. Mrs. Caro's thoughtfulness in allowing James one more night of innocent sleep felt like an act of mercy. "Thank you, Mrs. Caro. That's exactly right." Alexander climbed the stairs to his bedroom, but the idea of sleeping in the bed he had shared with Catherine felt impossible. Instead, he found himself in James's nursery, settling into the comfortable chair where Catherine had spent countless hours reading bedtime stories. From this position, he could watch his son sleep while processing the magnitude of what morning would bring. James would wake up as he had every day of his life, expecting the world to work the way it always had. He would ask for Mummy, and Alexander would have to explain that Mummy had died during the night, that the conversation they'd had at the hospital the day before had become suddenly, devastatingly relevant. A 3-year-old who had gone to bed with a sick mother would wake up an orphan, and Alexander would have to find words to make that bearable. As Alexander watched his son's peaceful breathing, Catherine's final words echoed in his mind with new layers of meaning. "Promise me you'll be happy." She hadn't asked him to promise to take care of James. That was a given, something that would happen regardless of promises. She hadn't asked him to promise to honor her memory or continue their charitable work. Those two were certainties. Instead, she had used her last breath to extract a promise that would be the hardest to keep, the one that would require the most active choice on his part. Happiness, in the wake of Catherine's death, felt like a betrayal. How could he pursue joy when she would never experience it again? How could he laugh or find pleasure in anything when the person who had brought him the greatest happiness was gone? But even as these thoughts tormented him, Alexander could hear Catherine's voice from their last real conversation, insisting that grief should not become a prison, that honoring her memory meant living fully rather than dying emotionally alongside her. Around 4 a.m., exhaustion finally overcame Alexander's racing thoughts, and he dozed fitfully in the nursery chair. He woke 2 hours later to the sound of James stirring in his bed, the small boy's internal clock as reliable as ever. For a moment, in the haze between sleep and waking, Alexander forgot what had happened. Then, reality crashed over him again with renewed force. James sat up in bed and looked around the room, his eyes brightening when he saw his father. "Daddy, why are you sleeping in my chair? Where's Mrs. Caro?" "Good morning, James," Alexander said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Mrs. Caro is downstairs making breakfast. I wanted to talk to you about something important." Something in Alexander's tone made James more alert, and Alexander could see his son's mind working, connecting this unusual morning routine with the serious conversation they'd had with Mummy at the hospital. "Did Mummy die?" James asked with the directness that only children possess. Alexander's throat tightened, but he forced himself to speak clearly. "Yes, James. Mummy died last night while she was sleeping at the hospital. She's not in pain anymore, but she can't come back to us." James considered this information with the same serious expression he'd worn during their hospital conversation. "Are you very sad, Daddy?" "Yes, I'm very sad." "Are you sad?" James nodded solemnly. "But Mummy said that's okay to be sad." "That's exactly right. It's very okay to be sad. And it's okay to cry if you want to, or to ask questions, or to tell me if you're scared or confused." "Will we still live here?" James asked, and Alexander realized his son was already beginning to understand that death changes everything, not just the presence of the person who died. "Yes, we'll still live here. And Mrs. Caro will still take care of you, and Grandmama Queen will still come visit, and all the people who love us will still be here to help us. They talked for another 30 minutes, James asking practical questions about where Catherine's body had gone, whether she could see them from heaven, and what would happen at the funeral he'd been told about. Alexander answered each question as honestly as he could while remaining age-appropriate, drawing on Catherine's wisdom from their previous conversation. When Mrs. Caro arrived with breakfast, James announced matter-of-factly, "Mummy died last night, but Daddy says it's okay to be sad about it." Mrs. Caro's eyes filled with tears, but she managed to smile at James. "That's exactly right, Your Highness. And what would you like for breakfast this morning?" As James became absorbed in the important decision between porridge and eggs, Alexander felt a moment of profound amazement at childhood resilience. His son was processing the biggest tragedy of his young life, while still maintaining his normal appetite and curiosity about the day ahead. It was a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, life continues to demand the small, ordinary acts of living. The rest of the morning was consumed with the grim machinery of royal death. Sir David arrived with draft statements for Alexander's review. Communications were coordinated with Buckingham Palace and Downing Street, and detailed funeral arrangements were discussed. The public announcement of Catherine's death was scheduled for noon, after which Alexander would need to make a televised statement to the nation. As noon approached, Alexander found himself in his private study, staring at the speech that had been prepared for him. The words were perfectly appropriate, dignified, grateful, and reassuring, but they felt like they belonged to someone else. How could any prepared statement capture the reality of what he had lost, or what the nation had lost in Catherine? At exactly 12 p.m., the official announcement was released. "It is with the deepest sorrow that we announce the death of Her Royal Highness Princess Catherine, who died peacefully at 23:47 on date, at St. Mary's Private Medical Center, surrounded by her loving family. Further details regarding funeral arrangements will be announced in due course." Within minutes, Alexander's phone was buzzing with condolence messages from world leaders. The palace switchboard was overwhelmed with calls from media outlets, and crowds were beginning to gather outside the palace gates with flowers and handwritten notes. 2 hours later, Alexander stood before television cameras in the same study where he had celebrated engagements, announced charitable initiatives, and recorded Christmas messages with Catherine by his side. Now he faced the cameras alone, knowing that millions of people were waiting to hear how their future king was processing the same grief they were feeling. "My fellow citizens," he began, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions beneath the surface. "Yesterday evening, my beloved wife Catherine lost her brave battle with cancer. She died peacefully, surrounded by love, and, in her final moments, she was thinking not of her own suffering, but of the happiness and well-being of those she was leaving behind. This was Catherine exactly as you knew her, selfless, loving, and concerned above all with the welfare of others." Alexander paused, allowing himself a moment to find strength for the words that followed. Catherine often said that the privilege of royal service was the opportunity to use your platform to make others feel less alone in their struggles. Today, I want you to know that in your grief for Catherine, I am not alone, and neither are you. We have lost someone extraordinary, someone who made each of us believe that kindness matters, that service to others gives life meaning, and that even in our darkest moments, we can choose to create light for those around us. The speech continued for several more minutes, touching on Catherine's charitable work, her love for James, and the family's gratitude for the public support during her illness. But it was the final paragraph that would be remembered, the moment when Alexander allowed his private grief to intersect with his public role in a way that felt unprecedented for the usually reserved royal family. "Catherine's final words to me were a request that I promised to be happy. She understood that grief is love with nowhere to go, but she also believed that love finds new ways to flow into the world if we remain open to possibility. I cannot promise that happiness will come easily or quickly, but I can promise that James and I will try to live in a way that honors Catherine's memory, with kindness, with service to others, and with openness to whatever joy life may still offer us. We ask for your patience as we learn to carry on without the woman who is the very best of all of us." When the cameras stopped rolling, Alexander felt simultaneously drained and oddly relieved. Sharing Catherine's final words with the nation had felt like a risk, too personal, too vulnerable for royal communication, but also like the truest thing he could say about the woman he had lost, and the impossible task of moving forward without her. In the days that followed, as funeral preparations intensified and the world's attention focused on the royal family's grief, Alexander would return again and again to those 5 words, "Promise me you'll be happy." They had become both a burden and a guiding light. A final gift from the woman who had taught him that love's greatest expression is wanting someone's happiness even when you can no longer share it. The funeral of Princess Catherine took place on a gray October morning that seemed to mirror the nation's collective mood. Westminster Abbey, which had hosted her wedding to Alexander just 3 years earlier, was now draped in black and filled with mourners from around the world. Kings and queens, presidents and prime ministers, along with representatives from the hundreds of charities Catherine had supported, came to pay their respects to a woman who had managed to touch millions of lives in her brief time as a royal. Alexander sat in the front pew with James on his lap, his 3-year-old son dressed in a miniature version of formal mourning attire. They had discussed whether James was too young to attend his mother's funeral, but Alexander remembered Catherine's words about not shielding their son from life's realities. He needs to say goodbye properly, Alexander had decided, and Mrs. Caro had spent the previous evening explaining to James what would happen during the service. As the Archbishop of Canterbury spoke about Catherine's life and legacy, Alexander found his attention drifting between the formal ceremony unfolding around him and the weight of James in his arms. His son was being remarkably still and quiet, occasionally whispering questions about the music or the flowers, but mostly just observing with the serious concentration that Alexander was beginning to recognize as James's way of processing big emotions. The most difficult moment came when Catherine's sister Eleanor rose to deliver a eulogy that captured the woman behind the royal title. Catherine always said that being a princess wasn't about wearing tiaras or living in palaces, Eleanor said, her voice carrying clearly through the ancient abbey. She believed it was about using whatever platform you had to make other people feel less alone. Whether she was comforting a grieving parent at a children's hospital, advocating for better mental health resources, or simply listening to someone who needed to be heard, Catherine understood that the greatest gift we can give each other is the assurance that we matter. Eleanor's words painted a picture of the Catherine that Alexander had fallen in love with, not the polished public figure, but the woman who stayed up late writing personal notes to people she'd met at charity events, who insisted on doing her own grocery shopping because she enjoyed chatting with the clerks, who cried at every movie regardless of whether it was supposed to be sad. When the service concluded and Catherine's coffin was carried from the abbey, Alexander felt James's small hand slip into his. "Daddy," his son whispered, "is Mummy really in that box?" "Her body is," Alexander replied quietly. "But the part of Mummy that loved us is still here with us, just in a different way." James nodded solemnly, accepting this explanation with the matter-of-fact way that children sometimes approach life's biggest mysteries. The burial service at Windsor Castle was smaller and more private, attended only by close family and friends. As Catherine's coffin was lowered into the ground, Alexander felt the finality of death in a way that the hospital room somehow hadn't conveyed. This was truly the end. No more conversations, no more shared glances, no more of the easy partnership that had made even the most challenging aspects of royal life feel manageable. But even in that moment of ultimate farewell, Alexander could hear Catherine's voice, "Promise me you'll be happy." The words had taken on new meaning over the past week, evolving from what had initially felt like an impossible request to something more like a roadmap for survival. In the weeks that followed the funeral, Alexander discovered that grief was not the linear progression he had expected. Some days were better than others, but there was no predictable pattern to when the waves of sadness would hit or how intense they would be. He might manage an entire morning of meetings and official duties only to break down completely while helping James with his bedtime routine, triggered by something as simple as their son asking for the lullaby that Catherine used to sing. James, meanwhile, was processing his mother's death with the remarkable adaptability of childhood, but also with moments of profound sadness that broke Alexander's heart. One evening, about a month after the funeral, James announced at dinner that he had decided to save half of his dessert in case Mummy comes back and wants some. Alexander gently explained again that Mummy couldn't come back, but that it showed how much James loved her that he wanted to share with her. "But I don't want to forget her," James said, his lower lip trembling. "You won't forget her," Alexander assured him. "We'll make sure of that. Would you like to look at some pictures of Mummy after dinner?" They established new rituals to help James maintain his connection to Catherine's memory. Every Sunday, they would spend an hour looking through photo albums, with Alexander telling stories about the pictures and encouraging James to share his own memories. They planted a garden in Catherine's honor, with flowers she had loved, and James was given the responsibility of watering them and talking to them about his day, a suggestion from the child psychologist who was helping them both navigate grief. Alexander found that talking about Catherine with James was actually healing for both of them. His son's questions forced him to remember not just the fact of Catherine's death, but the fullness of her life, her terrible sense of direction, her inability to keep plants alive, except for the ones in James's memory garden, which seemed to thrive under his devoted care, her habit of talking to the television during cooking shows as though the chefs could hear her suggestions. 3 months after Catherine's death, Alexander made his first official public appearance at the opening of a new wing of a children's hospital, a project that Catherine had been instrumental in planning but hadn't lived to see completed. As he walked through the bright, cheerful corridors designed to make sick children feel less frightened, Alexander felt Catherine's presence in a way that was both painful and comforting. The hospital staff had prepared a small plaque acknowledging Catherine's role in the project, and when Alexander saw it, he had to pause for a moment to compose himself. In memory of Princess Catherine, who believed that every child deserves to feel safe, loved, and hopeful for the future. Dr. Sarah Chun, the hospital's chief pediatrician, approached Alexander during the tour. Princess Catherine was supposed to be here for this opening, she said gently. She was so excited about the sensory garden and the family kitchen areas. She said that healing happens best when families can stay together. That sounds exactly like something Catherine would say, Alexander replied. She always understood that medical care is about more than just treating symptoms. Would you like to see the memory room? Dr. Chen asked. It was Catherine's idea, a quiet space where families can process difficult news or say goodbye if necessary. She said that hospitals needed to acknowledge that not every story has a happy ending, but every family deserves dignity and privacy during their hardest moments. The memory room was beautiful in its simplicity, soft lighting, comfortable seating, artwork created by former patients, and large windows overlooking a peaceful garden. Alexander could see Catherine's influence in every detail, her understanding that small gestures of care could make enormous differences in people's experiences of crisis. She was remarkable, Dr. Chen continued. Most of our royal patrons visit once or twice a year for photo opportunities, but Catherine came here every month. She knew the names of our long-term patients, remembered details about their treatments, brought books for our teenage cancer patients because she said they were the most likely to be bored. As Alexander listened to Dr. Chen's stories, he felt something shift inside him. For the first time since Catherine's death, he was hearing about her life rather than her loss. He was being reminded of the tangible impact she had made, the ways in which her influence would continue even though she was gone. That evening, Alexander found himself in Catherine's study for the first time since her death. Her desk was exactly as she had left it, with neat stacks of correspondence, thank you notes she had been writing to donors, and a half-finished speech about the importance of arts education in schools. Alexander picked up the speech and read through Catherine's handwritten notes in the margins, ideas about incorporating music therapy into children's hospitals, questions about funding for rural schools, reminders to herself to follow up with specific individuals who had shared their stories with her. Even in this unfinished document, Alexander could see Catherine's approach to royal service. Deeply personal, thoroughly researched, and always focused on the human impact of policies and programs. She hadn't just attended events. She had studied the issues, built relationships with experts, and used her platform to amplify voices that might otherwise go unheard. As Alexander sat in Catherine's chair, surrounded by evidence of her work and passion, he began to understand what she had meant by asking him to promise to be happy. She hadn't been asking him to forget his grief or to pretend that her death didn't matter. She had been asking him to find a way to continue living fully, to honor their shared values by carrying on the work they had begun together, and to remain open to whatever forms of joy and purpose life might still offer. For the first time in months, Alexander felt something other than sadness when he thought about the future. It wasn't happiness yet, that seemed too large and distant a goal, but it was possibility. He could imagine continuing Catherine's work, raising James to understand the privilege and responsibility of service, and perhaps even finding new ways to use his position to help others. The next morning, Alexander called Sir David Thornbury to discuss resuming a fuller schedule of public engagements. "I want to focus on the causes Catherine cared about," he said. "The children's hospitals, the mental health initiatives, the education programs. I want to understand them the way she did, to continue what she started." "Of course, Your Royal Highness," Sir David replied. "Princess Catherine's staff have been maintaining her projects, hoping that you might want to take them on when you were ready." "I'm ready to try," Alexander said. "I'm not sure I'll be as good at it as Catherine was, but I want to honor what she built." That afternoon, Alexander met with Catherine's former private secretary, Lady Margaret Whitehall, who had been overseeing Catherine's charitable portfolio since her death. Lady Margaret spread out folders and reports covering dozens of organizations and initiatives, explaining the status of various projects and upcoming commitments that needed attention. Princess Catherine was particularly excited about this new partnership with the Royal College of Music, Lady Margaret explained, opening a thick folder. She believed that music therapy could be transformative for children dealing with trauma, and she had arranged funding for a pilot program in 5 hospitals. Alexander studied the proposal, recognizing Catherine's handwriting in the margins and remembering her excitement when she had first told him about the idea. "She used to say that music reaches parts of the brain that words can't touch," he said. "Exactly." She spent months researching the science behind music therapy, interviewing practitioners, and visiting programs in other countries. The thoroughness of her preparation was remarkable. As they went through project after project, Alexander began to see the scope of Catherine's impact more clearly. She hadn't just lent her name to charitable causes. She had become an expert in the field she supported, building relationships with researchers and practitioners, understanding policy implications, and using her platform strategically to advance meaningful change. "I want to continue all of this," Alexander said finally. "But I need to understand it the way Catherine did. I don't want to just show up for photo opportunities. I want to do the work." "Princess Catherine would be so pleased to hear you say that," Lady Margaret replied. "She always said that royal patronage should be about partnership, not just publicity." Over the following months, Alexander threw himself into understanding Catherine's work with the same intensity she had brought to it. He spent time in hospitals, schools, and community centers, meeting with the people Catherine had worked alongside, learning about the issues she had championed, and beginning to develop his own understanding of how royal influence could be used to create positive change. The work was demanding and sometimes emotionally difficult, but it was also deeply satisfying in a way that surprised Alexander. For the first time since Catherine's death, he felt connected to something larger than his own grief. He was honoring her memory not just through remembrance, but through action. 6 months after Catherine's funeral, Alexander was visiting a secondary school in Manchester that had benefited from one of Catherine's education initiatives when a 15-year-old student named Amara approached him after his presentation. "Your Royal Highness," she said somewhat shyly, "I wanted to thank you for what Princess Catherine did for our music program. Before she helped us get funding for instruments and a proper teacher, I'd never touched a violin. Now I'm planning to audition for music college." "Catherine would have loved to hear that," Alexander replied. "She believed that every young person deserves the chance to discover their talents." "Will you tell her?" Amara asked, then caught herself. I know she's not, but do you think she knows somehow?" Alexander felt his throat tighten, but also experienced something that might have been the beginning of happiness. Not the uncomplicated joy he had known with Catherine, but a deeper satisfaction that came from knowing that her influence was still touching lives, still creating opportunities, still making the world a little better. "I think she knows," Alexander said. "And I think she's very proud." As he drove back to London that evening, Alexander realized that he was beginning to understand what Catherine had meant by her final request. Happiness, in the context of grief, didn't mean forgetting or moving on. It meant finding ways to let love continue flowing into the world, to honor what had been lost by embracing what was still possible, and to trust that meaning could emerge from even the deepest sorrow. He was keeping his promise to Catherine, one day at a time, one act of service at a time, one moment of connection with their son at a time. It wasn't the happiness he had known before, but it was something authentic and valuable and worth building on. And for the first time since hearing those 5 devastating words in a hospital corridor, Alexander believed that Catherine would be proud of the way he was learning to carry on. 2 years after Catherine's death, Alexander stood in the same children's hospital where he had first begun to understand what it meant to continue her work. But this time he wasn't alone. James, now 5 years old and starting to grow into his mother's features while maintaining his father's determined chin, was beside him, carrying a small basket of books that they planned to donate to the pediatric ward. "Daddy," James said as they walked through the colorful corridors, "do you think Mummy would like that we're bringing books to the sick children?" "I think Mummy would love it," Alexander replied, squeezing his son's hand. "She always said that stories can take you anywhere, especially when you're stuck in a hospital bed." Over the past 2 years, Alexander had learned to navigate the complex terrain of single parenthood while managing his royal duties and continuing Catherine's charitable work. It hadn't been easy. There had been moments of overwhelming loneliness, nights when James had nightmares about losing his father too, and public scrutiny of every aspect of their lives as the press speculated about Alexander's emotional state and romantic future. But there had also been unexpected moments of grace. James was growing into a thoughtful, compassionate child who seemed to have inherited his mother's instinct for empathy. He asked thoughtful questions about the people they met during their charitable visits, insisted on donating his own toys to children who had less, and had an uncanny ability to sense when his father needed extra affection. "Mrs. Patterson at school says I look like Mummy," James announced as they entered the hospital's main lobby. "But I have your nose. You have the best parts of both of us," Alexander said, which had become his standard response to these observations. He was determined to keep Catherine's memory alive for James without making her into such a perfect figure that their son felt he could never measure up to her example. Dr. Sarah Chun met them at the elevator, greeting James like an old friend. Over the past 2 years, their visits to the hospital had become a monthly tradition, and James had developed relationships with several of the staff members. "James, we have a new patient in room 304 who might enjoy that book about dragons you recommended last time," Dr. Chin said as they rode up to the pediatric ward. "The one with the friendly dragon who's scared of fire?" James asked seriously. "That's a good book for kids who are scared of things they think they should be brave about." Alexander marveled at his son's insight. At 5, James was already developing an understanding of human nature that reminded Alexander powerfully of Catherine. She had possessed the same ability to see beneath the surface of people's experiences, to understand that everyone was fighting battles that weren't immediately visible. Their first stop was the playroom, where James immediately gravitated toward a 7-year-old girl named Sophie who was undergoing treatment for leukemia. Alexander watched as his son shared his books and listened attentively while Sophie explained the game she was playing. There was something about James's presence that seemed to lift the spirits of the other children, and Alexander could see Catherine's influence in every interaction. After their hospital visit, Alexander and James drove to Regent's Park for their weekly picnic, a tradition they had started 6 months after Catherine's death as a way of creating new positive memories together. James insisted on the same spot every week, under a large oak tree that provided perfect climbing opportunities and a good view of the duck pond. As James unpacked their sandwiches with the careful attention to detail that characterized all his activities, Alexander's phone buzzed with a text message from his private secretary. It was a reminder about the gala that evening for the Catherine Foundation, the charitable organization Alexander had established in his wife's memory to continue funding the causes she had championed. "Daddy, are you going to the fancy party tonight?" James asked, having overheard the phone call Alexander needed to make to confirm final arrangements. "Yes, but just for a few hours. Mrs. Carroll will read you your bedtime story, and I'll come kiss you goodnight when I get home." "Will there be other princes and princesses there?" "Some," Alexander replied, "but mostly just people who cared about Mummy and want to help continue her work." The Catherine Foundation Gala had become one of the most anticipated charitable events in London, not because of its social significance, but because of its genuine impact. In just 2 years, the foundation had funded music therapy programs in 12 hospitals, provided scholarships for disadvantaged students to attend arts programs, and supported mental health initiatives in dozens of schools. Alexander took pride in the fact that Catherine would have approved of both the foundation's work and its approach, thorough, compassionate, and focused on measurable outcomes rather than publicity. That evening, as Alexander dressed for the gala, he found himself thinking about how different his life had become. 2 years earlier, preparing for a formal event would have involved Catherine sitting at her dressing table, sharing gossip about the other attendees, or rehearsing talking points about the evening's cause. Now, Alexander prepared alone, but he no longer felt the acute loneliness that had characterized the first year after her death. The gala was held at the National Gallery, among the paintings that Catherine had loved. Lady Margaret Whitehall had suggested the venue, remembering how Catherine had often said that art had the power to remind people of their shared humanity. As Alexander moved through the elegantly decorated galleries, greeting donors and supporters, he felt Catherine's presence in the carefully chosen details. The flowers from her memory garden, the menu featuring her favorite foods, the musicians performing pieces she had particularly enjoyed. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a music therapist whose program had been one of the Foundation's first major grants, approached Alexander during the cocktail reception. "Your Royal Highness, I wanted to update you on the progress we're seeing with the children in our program. The results have exceeded even our most optimistic projections." "Catherine always believed in the power of music to heal," Alexander replied. "She would be thrilled to know about your success." "Actually," Dr. Rodriguez continued, "I have something I'd like to share with you." She pulled out her phone and showed Alexander a video of a young boy playing piano. "This is Marcus. He came to us 6 months ago, completely nonverbal after experiencing severe trauma. Through music therapy, he's not only begun speaking again, but he's shown remarkable musical talent." As Alexander watched the video of Marcus playing a simple but beautiful melody, he felt the familiar mixture of sadness and satisfaction that had become characteristic of his work with the Foundation. Catherine would have loved this boy, would have insisted on meeting him personally, would have found a way to ensure his musical education continued. Her absence from these moments of triumph was still painful, but Alexander had learned to carry both the grief and the joy simultaneously. The evening's keynote speaker was Eleanor, Catherine's sister, who had become an important partner in the Foundation's work. As she spoke about Catherine's belief that everyone deserved dignity and opportunity regardless of their circumstances, Alexander found himself remembering the conversation he and Catherine had shared in her hospital room about letting himself be happy. Catherine used to say that happiness wasn't a destination, but a practice, Eleanor said to the gathered audience. She believed that we find joy not by avoiding life's difficulties, but by facing them with love, with service to others, and with faith in the possibility of positive change. The Catherine Foundation exists to put that philosophy into action. After Eleanor's speech, Alexander was scheduled to make brief remarks thanking the evening's supporters. As he stood at the podium, looking out at the faces of people who had chosen to honor Catherine's memory through their generosity, Alexander felt something that could only be described as happiness, not the uncomplicated joy of his early marriage, but something deeper and more complex, earned through struggle and sustained by purpose. 2 years ago, Alexander began, I thought I understood what loss meant. Catherine's death taught me that grief is not something you recover from, but something you learn to carry. Tonight, surrounded by evidence of the continuing impact of her values and vision, I'm learning that love doesn't end with death. It transforms into something new, something that can touch lives she never had the chance to meet. Alexander spoke about the Foundation's achievements, thanked the donors and volunteers who made the work possible, and shared stories about the children and families who had benefited from Catherine's ongoing influence. But it was his closing words that would be remembered and quoted in the next day's press coverage. Catherine's final words to me were a request that I promised to be happy. For a long time, I thought that was impossible. How could I be happy without her? Tonight, I understand that happiness, like love, can take forms we never expected. I am happy when I see a child discover their musical talent through one of our programs. I am happy when James shows kindness to a friend who is struggling. I am happy when I realize that Catherine's influence is still growing, still touching lives, still making the world a little better. This is not the happiness I thought I wanted, but it is the happiness I have chosen to build, and Catherine was right. It is worth the promise she asked me to make. After the gala, Alexander returned home to find James fast asleep, clutching a photograph of Catherine that he kept on his bedside table. Mrs. Caro reported that James had been unusually thoughtful at bedtime, asking questions about whether people in heaven could see the good things that happened on earth. I told him that love doesn't die, Mrs. Caro said quietly, and that when we do good things, the people who loved us most can feel proud, wherever they are. Alexander kissed his sleeping son's forehead and made his way to his own bedroom. But instead of going straight to bed, he found himself drawn to the window that overlooked Catherine's memory garden. In the moonlight, he could see the flowers that James tended so carefully, the small bench where they often sat to talk about their day, and the oak tree that Catherine had planted the week before James was born. #The Crown's Silent Grief, a fictional royal story disclaimer. This is a work of complete fiction. All characters, events, and situations are entirely imaginary and not based on any real people or events.